All right, welcome back to Relatively Conscious. Again, I'm Antonis Brown.
Irvin Bryant.
It's time for everybody's favorite segment of the debate.
Gentlemen and lady, this is the hot spot. You will enter it at your own risk.
The resolution is
Resolved. The American people should remove all memorials dedicated to the memory of oppressors.
gotcha. All right, so you're going to be the F and I'll be the neg.
All right. Affirmative, first things first, definitions. American people, simple enough. Remove by force or by law. So something really lit a fire within me. It gave me great joy to see Christopher Columbus fall in multiple locations too. It's really, really great. So yeah, remove in one way or another. And memorials for oppressors is going to be, any statue, engraving, building dedication, not the building itself, don't tell the building, but the name off the building, right? Any memorial for someone who was a slave trader, someone who was a segregationist, a slave owner, a Confederate soldier, someone who really, as we understand life now, was straight up for oppression. Bystanders are bystanders, product of the time, but even if you're a little bit racist, product of the time, but if you were on the side of oppression, you got to go.
Gotcha.
People who hated gay people, get out of here. Hated trans people, get out of here.
Gotcha. Yeah. All right, so
Native Americans, get out of here.
Your first argument.
Mexicans, get out of here. Can't be hating people around me. All right, first things first. Memorials are key. There's a purpose behind memorials. You want to remember the aspects of this individual that are most prominent. And if the most prominent thing about Christopher Columbus is that he crossed the ocean blue in 1492, that's great. But the fact is, and the true impact of his actions is, he brought with him a wave of death, rape, and destruction, right? And so when he lands on Hispaniola and runs into Ainu people, instantly, his first instinct is okay, first off, you're Indians. And second off, you look good, time to rape, time to enslave, and cares none about any of their culture, language, their desires, how they would like to trade. Just take. His actual impact is greater as one who enslaves, and his symbol is greater for those who live around that memorial as one who enslaves and destroys than one who has discovered. By the way, not the first to discover. People already lived there, and other people had traveled by boat to the Americas anyway. So the fact of the matter is, when we have Confederates, slave traders, whatever, all of that baggage comes with the memorial, and we want to remember it, but do we want to honor it, right? Their legacy. Second, beyond the fact that we're actually making bad things look good, is that they aid in the teaching of false history. We've kind of touched on this throughout our segments on this edition of Relatively Conscious. But as we look at how people resist change with a red pill, or how political change is difficult because people want to ruminate on Black Lives Matter and what does it mean, and oh wow, I was not aware of this oppression. It's because you intentionally, not you white person viewer, but the system of white supremacy intentionally memorializes and elevates a Christopher Columbus, memorializes and elevates a Jefferson Davis as a gentleman and a scholar, a leader, and a man who is to be respected despite his more than numerous, more than public sins, right? They stood for bad things. And even if they may have, accidentally done something pretty remarkable along the way, the fact remains that being a slave trader, that being your business, destroys the rest of it. And if I ignore or act like the slave trader part doesn't exist, then there's a whole layer of life that I don't see and live in. And so when Black people ask or fight or petition for any particular rights or for these injustices to end, I don't know that they existed in the first place. Christopher Columbus is a stand-up guy. Jefferson Davis is a hero. He fought for his homeland when they were encroached upon by Northern aggression. I don't get it. It's about states' rights. And so when we venerate the evil, that has a negative impact on those who are victims of that evil. And when we lie about and obscure those evils, those who are unaffected are unfeeling and callous to those who are affected. And we, at the end of the day, have to end up having a riot and tearing them down by force. And then we got the cops and the presidents putting out photos of people, real police state style. And we're hunting down people who simply wanted to have the common decency and respect of not having a person who potentially owned their ancestors having a statue in the middle of the street.
Mm-hmm. Right, so to negate this argument, right, I say negation the idea that, yes, we can tear down the statues of the Confederacy. There are traitors, they shouldn't have statues in the first place, right? I don't understand why their military bases named after Confederate soldiers. That makes no sense to me. Fort Hood, Fort Bragg, no, right? But I think there is a line we need to hit. As time moves on, what is oppression changes, right? As we know more, as we learn more, to become more caring, what is oppressive changes, right? So I think Confederate statues need to come down, right? But questions about George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, those become more interesting to me, right? So like George Washington is more because he's the first president of this country. He has a memorial because he was the leader of the army, right? Also because he shepherded in a time where we understood, he gave presidential norms, right?
Yes, presidents.
Right. So therefore, I think that's why we have a statue of him, right? And then when he died, he freed his slaves, right? And that wasn't. He knows in his writing, he says himself, that I should have done this when I was alive. I like being rich. I'm going to do it when I die. Right? And
I don't want to cut my own grass.
Yeah, there's a whole problem with that, right?
Yes,
Thomas Jefferson has a whole line from a slave that he raped, right? So there's a whole question about that, but Thomas Jefferson's main contribution that we think of as Declaration of Independence, right? So I think there's conversations to have there. As long as when you teach Thomas Jefferson in school, you talk about descendants from that disgusting arrangement, right? If you talk about George Washington, talk about the slaves that he had with him in Valley Forge, at the same time you talk about his daring feats against a British army at the same time, I think we can have that conversation, right? If you talk about Abraham Lincoln and you talk about his entire thinking on race, right, then I think that's a good place to start, right? So Abraham Lincoln has a statue in Emancipation Park, That I don't really like how it looks, it's like...
Oh, that is bad, and people are trying to tear it down.
Yeah, so like...
They have not already.
Yeah, so I think if we're going to have a statue to Lincoln, it should look better than that, Yeah,
by the way... Well, put the photo up, but he's got a slave kneeling and like begging for freedom at his feet as he looks down on this pitiful black gentleman. Maybe I will, maybe I won't give you freedom.
And then Franklin Dozier even talks about that when he spoke at the opening, right? There's the Theodore Roosevelt statue that doesn't look particularly well. Theodore Roosevelt is known for breaking up the big banks, breaking up the railroad companies, giving us the national parks, right? But I think the statue just doesn't look correct, right? So in negation, I think there is a line to the oppressors that we should have, right? I think we should tear down the statues of Confederate traitors, right? Straight up people who made their entire earnings in slave trade. I think statues should be torn down, right? The people who have who are more complex than that, right? Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, I think we should talk about and think about deeply, right? But I also think that we should understand that there has to be a line, because in the future, we also talk about the fact that we own iPhones and buy Nikes. There are slaves in Asia that are toiling away making these products, right? At some point, to come back and say, Antonio Brown, you had a lot of great things, but you contribute in a capitalistic system that kept people in figurative chains, Yeah. And when I say the system in China is a problem, there are suicide nets outside of buildings to keep people from committing suicide.
That's how bad their work conditions are.
Their work conditions are, right? So at some point in the future, they're going to start asking questions about why we allow that system to continue, right?
And participate in it.
At some point, we're going to have a conversation about Martin Luther King's standpoint on gay people and trans people, right? Because if we go back to his writings, you're going to realize he was a Southern Baptist preacher, right? So at some point in 20, 50 years from now, Are they going to tear down Martin Luther King statue because he didn't particularly feel that gay people should get married? You know, are we going to have these conversations, right? So I think there is a line. I think traitors and people who participated in the slavery apparatus, right, wholeheartedly participated in it, shouldn't get statues, right? But I think other people, we should teach history correctly in school. I think if we taught history correctly in school, we wouldn't have these problems, right? And then we should turn down the statues that there are people who are traitors to America.
I'll answer all of your arguments kind of together.
Right.
Where if we taught history correctly in schools, we would have torn the statues down already, right? Like, there's no way you can understand the evil and the callous bloodlessness one has to see when looking at another human being in total bondage without any kind of freedom, right? John C. Calhoun in Charleston, South Carolina, is erected up on an obelisk 100 feet in the air, with a bronze statue that takes the same stance, kind of a Captain Morgan, one leg up, that he took when at that same harbor, slaves would come in and he would examine them. He would look down upon them in the same way he looks down upon people of Charleston right now. Unless they've torn it down by now, which would be excellent. And so if we had that education and understood how horrible a person could be, despite what he'd done for the state of South Carolina, he's got to come down.
Right.
And if we continue to teach history correctly, and we learn the full history of individuals. So if we begin to publicly, because we haven't really yet, begin to publicly, even in public education, respect the lives and rights of gay and trans people. And if we, in the future, because it's not going to happen today, I don't believe in my lifetime, begin to respect the lives of those negatively impacted by neo-imperialism. So those Africans and Indians and Bangladeshis and Chinese and Vietnamese who are coerced into working in horrible conditions and making all this cheap garbage for Americans to have, right? When we respect their personhood and our values change, just like they have with slavery, because it was commonplace. No one batted an eye at George Washington, or few did. Then the statues memorializing Antonius Brown will have to come down. And I think because we have evolved so much, or will have, and we have evolved so much already, our monuments just ought to reflect our values. And again, tear them down, right? But don't forget the history. People say, put the statues in museums. Keep the information in a museum. Write it in a book. Wikipedia, I don't care. But we can't memorialize those things that also are an evil specter, an oppressor, a demon in the history of others. If I won't tolerate it today, then why should I ask you to tolerate it tomorrow? And so, Martin Luther King may have to go. I love him to death. You know what I'm saying? I would, if I could be a shadow of Martin Luther King in my lifetime, I'd be elated I could die peacefully. But in the future, if that goal of mine is disgusting, throw me away.
Interesting. I think, then we get to, my personal view, because we can go back and forth all day. But personally, I feel as if, I think the statues of Confederates just gotta go.
They gotta go.
I think the fact that military bases named after Confederates gotta go.
That's ironic.
Yeah, it's ironic. I think it's pretty easy for the military because we have Medal of Honor recipients, many times men who died, giving their lives to the highest level of service, right? Just name the bases after them.
The best soldiers,
call it a day. And I'll be perfectly fine with that, So, that makes sense. And I think that when we talk about in the future, we talk about how history is going to change and how we view history, the slippery slope argument is interesting because it's an interesting, mind game to play.
Thought experiment.
But I think at the end of the day, really, I think it's just the most egregious that people really care about. I think if we really got to really poll a lot of America, do they want to tear down Thomas Jefferson? Probably not. But I think the problem is because Jefferson Davis still stands, I am also going to turn down Thomas Jefferson to get your actual attention on this issue. I also think some people like to tear things down, and there's not a PhD sitting there saying, "Hey, not him, but yet that one right there."
Right.
But I think at the end of the day, people are pissed off, because statues of Confederates still stand, And so now I'm gonna start coming for George Washington if you don't start tearing down these other ones.
Yeah, and so maybe if I ask for a mile, you'll give me a yard, hopefully, just to get out of my face. But let's keep in mind, I want to throw some numbers out there. Yeah. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, 300 and 400 slaves owned as individuals. They're very rich and powerful people who owned very poor and powerless people in the multitudes.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah.
I think history is complex.
It is.
And if you learn it correctly, like me personally, I don't have to wrestle with the history of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. I knew that from the get-go, But I was homeschooled, and then most people go to poor public school, doesn't teach you very correctly. Today, you're waking up, you're like, Thomas Jefferson did what?
I had an argument with Miss Jackson at Chenoweth Intermediate in 7th grade about states' rights, and Miss Lowe the following year in 8th grade about states' rights being the reason for the Civil War. So, the feeling that I gotta tear it down, it's gotta stop, is that I have taken a genuine red pill. I've waken up from the matrix of the white, master narrative, and I realized that, oh wow, Christopher Columbus is the worst. I would never like this person if he existed today. And so that realization caused a violent reaction where, like Neo in the Matrix, I gotta run in the bank.
Would you please remove any metallic items you're carrying? Keys, loose change. Holy shit! Ugh.
It's just empty the clip on everybody. Destroy all these statues.
I will leave you one last thing. Yeah. Robert E. Lee said, "Don't put a statue up of me." Robert E. Lee, the guy who y'all love to put a statue up of.
Lee High School.
Yeah. He said it himself. Don't put a statue up of me. Right. So at the end of the day, if the man said it himself,
hey, gotta tear it down.
Turn him down.
Yeah.
All right. So that was the debate portion. Let us know in the comments how you feel. Should the statue of Thomas Jefferson come down? So the statue of MLK come down? That's interesting.
Where does the line get drawn?
Yeah. So this is Relatively Conscious. Again, I'm Tony Brown.
Irvin Bryant.
And see you guys next week.